Hello, I'm a Mac, and I'm a PC. You know, there are a lot of things that we have in common. We run a lot of the same applications, like Microsoft Office, but we retain a lot of what makes us, us. You should see what this guy can do with a spreadsheet. Insane. Oh, you. And he knows I'm better with fun stuff, like making music, movies, photo books, that sort of thing. Whoa. What do you mean by better? Well, us Macs have iMovie, iPhoto, iWeb. They all work so seamlessly. iLife comes with every Mac. Yeah, well, I have a lot of cool apps that are bundled with me as well. Oh, really? Like what? Calculator. Cool. Anything else? Clock. Sounds like, yeah, hours of fun. While technology, its design, and intended use has continued to change rapidly over the past several decades, one thing has remained the same: tribalism. This applies especially to computers, since they are getting easier to use and are developing more ways for people to use them. They are, of course, attracting more people over time. People from all kinds of backgrounds, with all kinds of opinions. It's only natural. And from all this sprouted one notable debate that is as old as the information age itself. Mac or PC? But wait, aren't Macs also PCs? Yes, they are. Before you correct me in the comments. But that also isn't really the point, because PC has since become a bit of an umbrella term that refers to any computer that runs Microsoft Windows, or to a lesser extent, Linux. This framing of the word was hugely carried by Apple's famous Mac versus PC commercials throughout the 2000s. But regardless, the battle between these two platforms was already well established and in full heated force. While much of this debate does boil down to simply preference, like Team Edward and Team Jacob, or Team Draco, there also are a lot of practical, technical, and economic reasons for why someone may be better suited for one over the other. So we're going to dive right into the history of this seemingly never-ending war between Mac and PC, the reasons behind it, and how things have changed over time. But it wasn't always this way. What if I told you there was a time where Apple and Microsoft were actually friends? Well, sort of. Instead, Apple's biggest rival was another company, IBM. It all started in the late 1970s. Apple was quickly emerging as the underdog of the computer industry. Of course, this was way before the Macintosh. It was all thanks to the massive success of the Apple II. Now, the Apple II is by no means the first personal computer, but Apple sure acted like it was. Much of their advertising was actually quite cheeky about it, and this totally worked in their favor. Because of the timing and place of when it was released, and the way it carried itself, the Apple II was, for many people, the very first personal computer they ever used. At this time, when most people thought of computers, they thought of those big, intimidating mainframes with a bunch of buttons and lights that you typically saw in work settings. Most of these mainframes were made by IBM, but the Apple II, the personal computer, was much less expensive, much easier to use, and it was small enough to fit on a desk, rather than take up an entire living room. It was the computer for the common man. The facts didn't matter. It was all about optics, which is what advertising ultimately is. Apple's understanding of this was a huge part of their success that allowed them to become the symbol of the PC over the next 5 years. But then in 1981, something quite historic happens. This is the year that you could argue the Mac versus PC debate truly began. IBM releases the 5150, their very first line of personal computers. IBM already had massive market share in the computer industry thanks to their mainframes. The whole point of Apple's existence was to divert from that, stick it to the man. They were making a computer that was much more inclusive and democratic, rather than utilitarian and uniform. IBM entering the space felt like the rich was getting richer. Apple was, of course, intimidated by this, but they couldn't show it. So Steve Jobs takes out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal called "Welcome IBM." Seriously, instead of being afraid, The ad was snarky and quite patronizing to IBM, using language like, "We invented the first personal computer system," and "We look forward to responsible competition in the massive effort to distribute this American technology to the world." Apple acknowledged that there was new competition, while affirming that they were still the ones in charge. "He didn't dump me, I dumped him." If you've seen the show Mad Men, it reminds me a lot of the famous "Why I'm Quitting Tobacco" ad that appears in the show. When the main character's ad agency loses a big tobacco account, which gives them a lot of negative PR, they effectively switch the narrative to say, "No, we fired them," turning a big problem into a giant advertisement for their company. Apple did the same thing with IBM, and their rivalry within this domain officially began. Unlike Apple, IBM did not create their own operating system for the 5150. Instead, they outsourced their software development to another company, Microsoft. And this operating system was called MS-DOS. This relationship dynamic between IBM and Microsoft was mutually beneficial. A big part of it was familiarity. Yes, Apple was successful at this time, but their name was new and they were still developing a reputation. Most people already knew IBM as the company that made computers, and probably regularly saw their mainframes when they went to work every day. Those looking to buy a personal computer are most likely going to choose the one that they are familiar with. Additionally, the IBM PC almost immediately supported some of the most popular software that already existed on the Apple II. So now IBM had familiarity and nearly identical software support on their side. Now, there were several more factors, and the entire battle between IBM and Apple could be its own separate video, but these were the main circumstances that allowed for some healthy competition between the two, and therefore gave MS-DOS more exposure. By 1983, IBM's PC even surpassed the Apple II in sales. But then, another PC would enter the picture that would dominate both these platforms: the Commodore 64. This machine had several things to its advantage. It had better graphics in both these machines, better sound, more RAM, and a better processor, just to name a few. It could also be hooked up to a TV, but this time, it looked better. The Commodore platform already existed with their previous models, but these very enticing features of the 64 quickly attracted more software developers to switch over. This significantly increased software support for the machine, on top of everything else. And of course, it was much cheaper. It cost only $595, while the IBM and Apple II were double that. The Commodore remains the highest-selling PC of all time. So naturally, today's feud should be Mac versus Commodore, not Mac versus Windows, right? Well, not quite. You see, poor business decisions on Commodore's end would eventually take them out of the spotlight. For one, they started to cut funding for research and development to save money. They essentially got overconfident with their products, and as competing computers became more powerful over the years, Commodore machines were becoming less impressive. Then there was another factor that would essentially be the final nail in the coffin for Commodore: open architecture. At this time, you see the rise of something called IBM Clones. IBM's design emphasized open architecture, meaning that manufacturers could essentially copy and use the designs of these IBM PCs just as long as they didn't use the parts that were copyrighted, such as the BIOS. Reverse engineering the IBM BIOS and replicating it was illegal and could get you into a lot of trouble. But how did developers work around this? Through something called clean room design. Instead of studying the code, which they are not allowed to see, engineers instead study the BIOS's functionality by looking at things like manuals and taking notes based on how certain buttons and commands behave. They then hand these notes over to a programmer who uses their independent technical knowledge to create a BIOS that behaves in a very similar way. Because IBM PCs used pretty much only off-the-shelf parts, they were one of the easiest machines at the time to replicate, or clone. It's a very interesting legal gray area, and the show *Halt and Catch Fire* does a really good job explaining it. Although it is a dramatized, fictional story, it is loosely based on the Compaq Portable, one of the pioneering IBM-compatible machines. Fun fact, a popular way that developers would check if their machine was IBM compatible was by checking if it could run Flight Simulator without crashing. Suddenly, IBM clones were now popping up everywhere, which now meant that MS-DOS was popping up everywhere. Because Microsoft did not have an exclusive deal with IBM, they could license their OS to all these machines without any problems. By 1987, MS-DOS had majority OS market share, and Commodore was not far from its decline. Despite these enormous sales, the reason Apple didn't die like Commodore was because of their marketing and continuous innovation. Apple's advertising was powerful. It spoke to the soul. It stayed with you. This alone gave their products a strong sense of identity, which created very loyal customers, or what we humorously call fanboys. This was enhanced by Apple's ambition to constantly make something better. As Steve Jobs said, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. In 1984, Apple created the Macintosh, which featured its new operating system called macOS System 1, abandoning the terminal command-like interface in favor of a point-and-click interface called a graphical user interface, or GUI for short. Now the computer was even easier to use and even more inclusive than the Apple II was. And Apple teamed up with none other than Microsoft to create programs for the Macintosh operating system, including programs like Microsoft Word, Multiplan, and eventually Excel. While revolutionary in many ways, the Macintosh was not perfect and did have a lot of problems. I've already made a separate video on the Macintosh, so I will be excluding a lot of the reasons. But as a result, it had bad sales. But it showed that GUIs were about to become the standard for future computers. And Microsoft particularly paid attention to this. In 1985, they create an operating environment, or MS-DOS. Basically a program that runs on top of the operating system to make it easier to use. It was called Windows, and had a GUI that was quite similar in appearance to the Macintosh. Bill Gates showed a prototype of Windows at Comdex in 1983, which made Jobs very upset. Jobs accused Gates of stealing the design from the Macintosh, which, ironically, the Macintosh took inspiration from the Xerox Alto. Bill Gates said it best. "It's like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox. I broke into his house to steal the TV set, only to find out that Steve had already taken it." And so, by the early 1990s, MS-DOS was installed on all kinds of computer models, which also meant that Windows was on these machines. While Apple's market share was much smaller, their customers remained very loyal. It was clear that big things were about to happen, and the Mac versus PC debate was in full force. Hello, I'm a Mac, and I'm a PC. Whoa, PC. What's with the ill-fitted suit? Just growing pains. Just upgraded to Vista from XP. Well, I have macOS 10 Leopard. Just WMP.dll. Huh? I don't even know what it means, it just happens. Oh, well, I gotta get this. What are you doing? Oh, Macs are able to text and make phone calls, iMessage, all in one place. Oh, cool. Well, here's a quarter, so you can call somebody who cares. Don't need it. I just use Mint Mobile. Mint what now? Oh, it's my wireless phone plan. It's super easy to set up. You get premium wireless without the premium price, and you can set up the whole thing online. It's great. Oh, really? Do tell. Well, every plan comes with unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network. Plus, you get free calling to Mexico, Canada, and even the UK. Even includes hotspot. 10 gigs on the unlimited plan. Yeah, saving money on a phone plan by buying a new phone in the process. Nice one. It's the oldest trick in the book. Actually, you can bring in your own phone. Same phone number, contacts, everything. Only takes a few minutes to switch over and you can do it at home. And if you change your mind within 7 days, you can get your money back. In fact, 96% of users rate themselves as highly satisfied with Mint Mobile's customer care. Starting plans are $15 a month. And I can reach my friends right away. Yeah, well, I can call my friends too. Hello, operator? Can you connect me to Robert in Acapulco? Gotta take this. No, I don't know his address. You don't have to snap at me. Hello? Jennifer, hey. Why is there a dial tone? Is Steven out of the house? Hello? Got his wallet? Great, I'll be right over. Buongiorno. Hello? With everything we just talked about, it probably makes a lot more sense why the term PC has been appropriated to mean Windows machine instead of, personal computer. Furthermore, it explains why the term has been pretty much separated from the Mac ecosystem entirely. As we discussed, Microsoft's operating system gained popularity through IBM-compatible machines, which were open architecture. One of the big philosophies behind a personal computer is that it's, personal. This means you should be able to choose your own device, your own parts, and your own system. The architecture is open. Apple devices, on the other hand, were closed off. Famously closed off. Pretty much all of the parts were proprietary, not just the BIOS. If you wanted to run macOS, you had to buy a computer directly from Apple. MS-DOS and Windows could run on basically anything else that was mainstream, making it a much more flexible operating system of choice, with a lot more customizability. So naturally, PC came to be associated with this setup, while the Mac was seen by the public eye as more of its own separate thing. But giving users too much choice can start to become a problem. And during the computer boom of the 1990s, this would truly start to manifest. Ironically, it showed up as a byproduct of the massive success that Microsoft saw during this decade, particularly with the launch of Windows 95. This version of Windows was different from the previous ones. It was no longer an operating environment, but instead an actual operating system. It was essentially a hybrid OS, making it much less DOS dependent, and it would even boot up automatically when you started the machine, as opposed to Windows 3.1 and earlier, where you actually had to run it as a program within DOS. It was cleaner, more organized, and easier to use. On top of that, they followed much of Apple's approach and made their advertising very fun and memorable, appealing to everyday people who were just starting to buy household computers. And of course, this all happened at the same time as the drastically rising popularity of the internet. It was a recipe for success. In contrast, Apple was not doing well. Steve Jobs had been out of the company for a whole decade, and since then, they had been making what were pretty much just derivative versions of the original Macintosh that were very uninspired. They were bleeding money and on the verge of bankruptcy.
Apple computers are very low-powered and very highly priced, and that's true of all Apple products.
And as we've discussed many times before on this channel, much of Microsoft's success certainly got to the best of them. At the turn of the millennium, Microsoft was facing accusations of quite predatory business practices, particularly with stifling competition of Windows and Internet Explorer. This, of course, led to an antitrust case where Microsoft was eventually declared a monopoly. They were popular, but their reputation took a big hit. At around this time, Apple brings Steve Jobs back as interim CEO, basically as a last resort decision. And then Apple and Microsoft set aside their differences and make an agreement. Much like the relationship between IBM and Microsoft in the early 80s, this was also something that formed out of mutualism. Microsoft paid Apple $150 million to have Internet Explorer be the default browser for the Mac, and got a 5-year guarantee that Microsoft Office would continue to be supported on the Mac. Apple gets the capital that they desperately needed at the time, and Microsoft helps some of their competition, therefore looking like less of a monopoly. Everybody wins. Well, sort of. Bill Gates was met with this reaction during the Macworld conference. It goes to show what the climate was like at this time. Despite this reaction, Jobs insisted in his speech that Apple succeeding did not mean that Microsoft had to lose. And thankfully, in many respects, you could say that Apple and Microsoft relations haven't been nearly as hostile ever since. Yes, Windows was much more customizable and worked on all kinds of computers, but if you're brand new to computers and know nothing about them, this can get intimidating. This overflexibility gave PCs the reputation of being big, ugly beige boxes that were slow, always crashed, had a million cables connected to them. If you wanted to hook something up to Windows, you had to install a bunch of drivers first. Yuck! It was just overwhelming and complicated. In 1998, Apple essentially reinvents the Macintosh, and it was the product that effectively brought them the success that they have now. It was called the iMac. Steve Jobs stated that the iMac was designed so that you could take it out of the box and already be on the internet within 10 minutes. Its vibrant, delicious colors, which resembled gumdrops, were a counter-response to these utilitarian beige Windows machines. As Steve Jobs also said, they look so good you kind of want to lick them. It was the #1 selling computer in America. In the year 2000, things only got better for Apple when they announced a reinvention of their Mac operating system. It was called Mac OS X. Not only did it sport a whole new look compared to its predecessor, with features like the dock and its famous aqua theme, it was also built on a new kernel, moving from an archaic, much more monolithic kernel over to a Unix-like kernel. It basically used the foundation of NextStep, the OS created by Next Computer, the company Steve Jobs made after he left Apple. And the Unix kernel had a reputation of being far more stable than DOS. It was much better at multitasking, which was basically non-existent on DOS. This would be more refined when the Windows 9X systems were released, but it was still far from perfect, and many of the problems DOS had were still present. Unix had the advantage of being primarily used by experienced researchers and engineers in very high-tech environments dating as far back as the 1960s. This gave the kernel much more time to become more polished and robust in comparison, and by the late 90s, computer hardware was powerful enough to handle such a kernel on an everyday machine. Unix just had more experience than DOS, or even the brand new NT kernel, which would become the standard in Windows 2000 and Windows XP. Yes, Mac OS X was only Unix-like and did not officially adapt the full Unix kernel until the release of OS X Leopard, but it was still a huge leap forward. It just further emphasized the nature of Windows' popularity. Microsoft products were never meant to be the best. They were designed to just be good enough. Instead, their popularity stemmed from convenience and just how commonplace it was. It was there, so people used it. This is the reason why Macs just work, and why Windows does stuff, well, like this.
And it's going to load in the appropriate drivers. You'll notice that this scanner build, whoa.
This stability, friendly design, and ease of use, complemented with Apple's signature, funny advertising, is what personified the Mac platform as the laid-back cool guy, and the PC as the nerdy, pedantic, insecure guy. Windows still maintained its majority market share, but lots of people moved over to the Mac for these reasons, which further created a very vocal, passionate, often ride-or-die fanbase for the company. The disastrous release of Windows Vista certainly didn't help, and the fact that the majority of people were still using Windows XP as late as 2009 didn't help either. For perspective, Mac OS X came out with Snow Leopard that year, which looked like this. This next point I'm about to bring up is mostly anecdotal on my end, but it undeniably had the biggest impact on me. It is what made me a very loyal Mac user for the longest time, and Microsoft didn't really have anything that was comparable. It was a software suite called iLife. It included programs like GarageBand, iPhoto, iWeb, iMovie, iDVD, you get the picture. The idea was that you could take your Mac out of the box and start using all these programs for free within 10 minutes, as they came pre-installed on the devices. As someone who was dabbling into video editing in 2008, 2009, there was pretty much no reason for me to ever use Windows again. Microsoft's counterparts like Windows Movie Maker and Photo Viewer were just so clunky and low quality in comparison. iMovie had a green screen feature. The only other programs that were on par with the quality of iLife were the Adobe Suite, which was premium. On top of that, I always hated Windows XP. Hot take, I know, but for me, it felt outdated, even back then. especially compared to the contemporary macOS X Tiger, which had Spotlight Search and what I felt was much easier navigation in Finder. I also love that the Mac came with a built-in webcam that was easy to access on all these iLife products. It felt easier to navigate. It never really crashed on me. It only required one cable, which made the setup feel so much cleaner. The designs looked very futuristic for its time. I never cared about picking my own parts. I was never much of a gamer. I was basically their model user. These are just some of the things that made the Mac a necessity for me as a creator, and why the price always felt justified for me. You were paying to not have to deal with the headache that often came with Windows machines at this time. And if you were someone in 2009 with no technical experience looking to buy a computer, let's be honest, which one are you more likely to buy? Of course, that part is just my opinion. Depending on your needs, a Windows PC may in fact be the better option for you. For example, because of its larger market share, Windows supports much more software than the Mac does. It also supports way more games, so if you need to access certain programs, this would be the natural choice. The same goes for if you want a certain setup that uses very specific hardware, or if you want to save money, as Macs are typically much more expensive. I can go on. And compared to the 2000s, you could say that PCs have finally caught up. Most off-the-shelf Windows computers come with things like webcams. Windows is much better than it was. Third-party freeware programs similar to iLife in the 2000s are now readily available on Windows and are just as good, if not better. It's almost as if computers have become too advanced, to the point where the tech space is now pretty homogenized. It all kind of looks the same and acts the same. So the choice between Mac and PC has become much more relative, and depending on how you look at it, that can actually be a good thing. In many respects, you're getting the best of both worlds, the convenience and ease of use that the Mac was famous for, along with Windows's flexibility. Regardless of what you choose, one fact remains: there truly is a computer for everyone. If you would like to learn more about the full history of the Macintosh, you can check that out here. You can also check out my Windows History series in the top right corner. If you would like a series on macOS, please let me know in the comments. A special thanks to all my Patreon supporters, patreon.com/nationsquid. A coffee is always appreciated too. Thank you for watching, everyone.